trauma in the character. There is an active use of this poem in a lot of psychotherapy and counseling and group therapy situations. A lot I know for returning soldiers from the military, from active war zones, who use this story as an objective correlative for reintegrating into society. Because remember, this is the story of Odysseus returning from war to go and try and fit back into polite society again. And just about everything in this story that is tracking his personal internal drama along the way is about that instinct of his. He is very violent, but he has to learn how to restrain himself in civilized society. But I think it's more than just that. He is recovering from a couple of different kinds of trauma. The way he negotiates that and the little hints that the text throws out, I think, are instructive and sets him up as a different kind of hero, a very vulnerable and wounded hero who has his own psychological journey to go through before he can return home in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense, return home to a kind of happy mental place. If you look at the very first scene with him, which is book 5, we've gone through the first 4 books with his son, and we've gotten that whole arc sort of played out. But then scene 5, he finally shows up in his own story, and he is looking out at the horizon. He is on a beach, staring out at the horizon, and we're told he is crying. Hermes has come down and spoken to Calypso and said, you got to cut Odysseus free. She objects, and then she concedes. She knows she can't buck Zeus, so she then goes to find Odysseus. Acknowledging the edict sent from Zeus, this is like line 149 in book 5. Acknowledging the edict sent from Zeus, the goddess went to find Odysseus. She found him on the shore. His eyes were always tearful. He wept sweet life away in longing to go back home, since she no longer pleased him. He had no choice. He spent his nights with her inside the hollow cave, not wanting her, though she still wanted him. By day she sat out on the rocky beach in tears and grief, staring in heartbreak at the fruitless sea. There is an obvious connection between their relationship, Calypso's and Odysseus's, and the trauma itself. At this moment, the poem is suggesting, I think, one thing very clearly. He's not necessarily crying for his wife. His eyes were always tearful. He wept sweet life away in longing to go back home, since she no longer pleased him. Who is she in this? Penelope? I don't think so. I think Calypso. He had no choice. He spent his nights with her inside her hollow cave. I know you can go Freudian about the hollow cave, but this is somebody who is the victim of sexual assault. He is being kept against his will. He is being essentially used for sex. He is being raped by this much more powerful figure on a daily basis. And that's what is mentioned in the text at this moment. He's not necessarily crying because, he misses his wife and child. Maybe he does, but that's not here. What is here is the is that feeling of vulnerability and exploitation that comes from sexual assault. And then that opens up, when you think of it in those terms, you start thinking of all those other times that he has been used like that. He has the relationship with Cersei, where the power dynamic between the two of them is so important. He eventually dominates her in that. At first, she is the very powerful witch who turns everybody into pigs. But the minute he shows up, he has taken a drug to ward off the power, and so he is immune, and he thus dominates her, gets her to change all his men back, and from that point on, she's essentially serving him throughout to help him in his cause of getting home. But even in that, he needs her. And he is sleeping with her on a regular basis to keep that relationship humming along, to not anger her. And yes, the relationship with Nausicaa, he is flirting with this girl because at that moment, on that beach, in that scene, she is more powerful than he is. All she has to do is scream, and presumably someone will come running and say, "Princess, princess, what is wrong?" She just has to point at him, and he's a dead man. Or at any point in the meeting with her parents, all she has to say is, "Mommy, he did something very inappropriate on that beach to me," and he would be killed. So he knows that he needs to be a victim in order to get home. The military aspect of it, I think, is also there. He has multiple traumas going on. When he is trying to choose between Scylla and Charybdis, and Cersei is advising him, you need to go and steer clear of Charybdis, because that's a whirlpool. It's going to suck down the whole ship. But if you go to Scylla and you steer on that side of the passageway, of the channel or whatever that you're going through, Scylla will come out, a female monster, mind you. She is always referenced as she. This embodiment or monstrosity embodiment of female rage, quite frankly. This monster, Scylla, will swoop down and grab half a dozen of your men at one time and eat them, and that's bad. But the rest of you will get by while she's chewing on those men. As horrible as that is, that provides a window of opportunity for you and your ship and the rest of your men to get through and get past and get to safety. And he reacts against that. Says, "No, I can't do that. I got to figure out a way." She castigates him, says, "No, you can't do that. You're always thinking of war, reacting of war." And that little check right there tells you about his headspace at that moment. He is thinking in terms of war. And when you get to the actual scene where he's going through those straits and he sees Scylla come down and steal his men away from him, I think it has a peculiar visceral quality that is begging for a little interpretation. Look at this. This is book 12, like around line 245 or so. "But while our frightened gaze was on Charybdis, Scylla snatched 6 men from the ship, my strongest, best fighters. Looking back from down below, I saw their feet and hands up high as they were carried off. In agony they cried to me and called my name, their final words. As when a fisherman out on a cliff casts his long rod and line set around with oxhorn to trick the little fishes with his bait, When one is caught, he flings it gasping back onto the shore. So those men gasped as Scylla lifted them up high to her rocky cave, and at the entrance ate them up, still screaming, still reaching out to me in their death throes. That was the most heartrending sight I saw in all the time I suffered at sea. Now, you can just read that on a literal level and say, well, okay, the monster comes down and takes all the men and all that. And, all right, fine. But the peculiarity of that choice that he has to make as the commander is between a strategic sacrifice of a few men so that the mission itself, the whole group, can survive and pass on, at the expense, or instead of the choice of everybody going down with Charybdis. That is the choice of a military commander. And when he's sitting there watching this happen, you can almost see him back in Troy as a military commander, sending his soldiers out to fight and saying, okay, this is the battle plan for the day. Let's go execute it. You guys go over there and take that hill. And he knows that those people going over there to take that hill are likely all going to die. But in order to attain the ultimate objective, that sacrifice has to be made. But that pain is still with him after making it. And that image of watching them get snatched up and so viscerally eaten, I think, is some of the most vibrant writing in the poem. It really, really sticks you in the gut when you hear it. But that torturous self-reflection in it too, where, they are calling out his name and he is powerless to help. They are screaming, still reaching out to me in their death throes. He feels the guilt of that sacrifice. He feels the pain of that loss. He knows it was his decision to say that their lives are expendable so that the rest of us can go on. That is the decision that every military commander from the history of civilization on has made. You cannot be a military commander unless you make that decision to send people out to die and be okay with that. But here you see him struggling with that. And this is that undercurrent of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that is, I think, bubbling throughout the whole poem. The last, think about the ending of the poem in terms of the violence that is unleashed. I think it's fair to say Odysseus goes a little overboard with the suitors. There's a very good argument that once he had that one symbolic kill of Antinous, who's the head suitor, so to speak, and he is killed very dramatically. First, where Odysseus takes the bow he has just strung and aims it and shoots Antinous right through the throat as he is in the process of guzzling a glass of wine, which has all sorts of symbolic references, because what have the suitors been doing but gobbling up all of Odysseus's wine and food for all of these years, and Antinous, as the head of them, has been sort of like the mouthpiece for them as well, so he gets shot through the throat, which is where food and sound both pass, so he's got to, that is a big symbolic moment. Odysseus could have stopped right there and said, look, I am Odysseus. I am back. You just saw me kill your friend. He had it coming. If you want to suffer the same fate, stay here. If you don't, there's the door. And then everything would be over. But he doesn't. He goes, arguably, a little overboard. A little overboard. He massacres everyone. It's a slaughter. It's horrifying. And he didn't need to do it. The poem could have stopped right there, basically, and said, and then he stepped back and said, that's enough. We've all learned our lesson. Everybody to their corners. But that carnage that follows, that raw animal violence that is unleashed in Odysseus, the pent-up rage that finds expression, is, I think, a reaction to everything that he has learned. As a soldier, as a hero on the battlefield, and he essentially was, that sort of violence is rewarded. That sort of violence is expected. It's less appropriate in peacetime. He has come home to civilization. He has come home to a peaceful home, domestic life. And that kind of violence is out of place. So that violence inspires the fathers of all of the suitors to launch their own insurgency against him, and they get basically they go and they gather their pitchforks, metaphorically, and they go charging up the hill to go face off against Odysseus. And Odysseus at this point is standing shoulder to shoulder with his father and his son in this enormous tableau of patriarchal aristocratic power. And all of these lower aristocrats, they're not necessarily commoners. They are all the hoi polloi of Ithaca and the surrounding islands, charging up the hill at them. And it takes an act of the gods to intercede and quell the violence. Athena calls out and says, Ithacans, stop. Basically, she just calls a timeout and sends everybody to their neutral corners and say, okay, we're not going to do this now. Zeus adds a thunderbolt to it as a little exclamation point to catch everybody's attention. And then Odysseus, as a bloodthirsty, violence-driven soldier hero himself, starts charging down the hill after all of the insurrectionists who are at that moment retreating. So he is chasing them to kill them as they are running away. And Athena steps in right then and says, no, we're not going to do this. And the poem basically ends right there. So that bloodlust gets bubbled up again in Odysseus, but it is the symbol of reason and rational order that Athena always represents that comes in and says, that's not the way we do things now. Odysseus needs to learn to restrain his violent impulses. He needs to learn how to get along in society, to be a productive member of a civilization who is within the rules of society and not above them. And that is on a sociopolitical level where this poem fits in with so many other works of literature from the ancient era, stuff like Gilgamesh, stuff like Confucius, a bunch of people who are coming and trying to find ways to pivot from a barbaric past into a civilized future by teaching people how to restrain their violent impulses and work and play well with others. When you look at that, the poem starts to make sense as a whole. You can see that through line from Odysseus, fresh from the fields of Troy, dripping in blood, theoretically, because that's not really in the poem, to this ending where he is ready to, theoretically, reintegrate into society peacefully. And that's why this has a special resonance among veterans groups, quite frankly. because they have trouble getting back into society peacefully. They have trouble with trust. And if there's ever somebody who, is an example of somebody who doesn't trust anybody, it's Odysseus. Learning to trust people, learning to feel comfortable in ordinary surroundings is a real challenge for military veterans, because they're used to, at any moment, somebody could lob a grenade at them and everybody dies. That's a tough thing to live with on a daily basis. Odysseus is in essentially the same boat. He is used to that kind of violence, that kind of, at any moment, horror could break out. So I need to be the bigger horror to beat it back. That works in war. It doesn't work in civilization. And being able to make that transition back into peaceful civil society is an essential step. You can see the same arc largely with the personal relations that he has with women in this, because if you just track the women, the female characters, women is a loaded term because so many of them are like goddesses and stuff. But if you just track like Calypso, Nausicaa, Circe, Athena, he has a great scene with Athena, and ultimately Penelope, his wife. He is slowly reacclimating into healthy male-female relationships. He's very suspicious of Calypso. When she first offers to let him go, he's like, well, you're just going to wait for me to get out to sea and then you're going to kill me, right? Very defensive, very untrusting. He is very deceptive with Nausicaa. We saw that. He is downright violent with Circe. The minute he shows her that he is not going to be turning into a pig anytime soon, he basically threatens her life. And it's kind of a scary little moment. And then from that moment, he has reasserted his male dominance in that household, and everything is fine once the man is in charge. Again, sort of like a gender dynamic thing going on there. But each time he has this meeting with a woman or a female character, it seems to go a little bit better. He seems to be working his way through his issues with this. A large number, of this, it helps to bear in mind the settings, quite frankly. The scene with Calypso happens on a beach. Interesting. Very picturesque. The scene with Nausicaa also happens on a kind of beach or on a riverbank. The scene with Circe happens in her home, which is kind of off in the woods. That's curious. The big scene he has with Athena is on another beach, and then the big scene, two scenes really, that he has with Penelope, and I think it's book 19 and 23, when he finally reveals himself to her, that is within their home. So Penelope and Circe, both those scenes with them happen in a home setting, and the others happen on beaches. And you can just think about, spitball some associations. What could a beach mean? It's not just a pretty setting. A beach is where two worlds meet, where the land and the sea come together in a kind of clear line between them, or maybe a blurred line between them. But it's where these two opposites tend to interact. The sea is also where Odysseus wants to cross to get home. He is stuck on land, and he has to cross the sea to get home. So it's got all of that symbolism wrapped up in it. The home is where he is headed the whole time, where he has said explicitly, I want to go home. Going with Cersei, that's an unnatural home. She is not his wife. She is a witch. She is a sort of demonic figure, so it is inappropriate. But it allows him to set up a kind of false home as a practice, where for that scene, for a full year, we're told, he is directing her and his men in building a new ship and preparing for his eventual journey home. A full year of doing that means he wasn't necessarily rushing, but maybe in that process he was working a little bit also. He and Cersei were essentially playing house throughout that, and he is learning how to deal with a female in that kind of domestic setting again. All of that is a precursor to when he goes home and actually meets with Penelope and reestablishes a kind of normative pattern of behavior with an appropriate female for him. We're told how well matched they are, and that's great. But you know, it's this isn't Tinder. What that is supposed to mean is that it is appropriate socially. They are of the same class. They are of the same intellect. They have many of the same dispositions. They are equals of a sort. Within that, however, of course, is that the man is supposed to be the superior. And we can go off on that for quite a while. But I just want to make these few points clear, because this is yet another way of getting into the poem. Just looking at it and saying, well, okay, what can this make out? What does it mean that he seems so irrational sometimes, that he seems so violent sometimes, that he seems so sad sometimes? This is a deeply depressed man. And all of those are little hints that can bring you into the story in different ways and start to develop meaning, and not just meaning like, oh wow, that is actually very interesting. How the people in the ancient era dealt with the horrors of war or something like that. No, that has immediate resonance today because there are people walking around with exactly these problems. And it's not just people in VA group therapy sessions, but if you look at the if you look at the sexual assault side of this, trauma, just ordinary garden variety sexual assault trauma that millions of people suffer with today, silently, afraid to say anything, but they can look down and they will recognize he was raped. He was held against his will and forced into a sexual relationship for years upon years upon years. And in one way or the other, he kind of repeated that throughout with a lot of other characters, a lot of other powerful female characters throughout, where he struggled for domination against them and control over them because he had so little control for so long with Calypso. And in reading that, I have to believe that sexual assault survivors today can find some solace. Like, okay, there's a way out of this. There's a way that you can feel better. People survive, and they always have, from 3,000 years ago until today. And that's got to be comforting.